This is a conversation I had with Bill Morgan. Bill and I spoke on Monday, September 26, 2022. We talked about his education and mentorship under Bob Osterhout, his time as a professor at the universities of Minnesota, Tennessee, Ohio State, and University of Southern California. We speak of his relationships with Bob Simon, Bernard Suits, John Russell, and a number of other folks. We get into the weeds a little bit, speak of formalism, conventionalism, internalism. We don't say much about Bill's two books, but I have those on the slide here because many people will know him from those books and his numerous articles as well. We talk about Bill's top 3 philosophy of sport books and top 3 articles on the subject, which of course is a comically short list. Impossible. I'm sure I frustrated him with that. We speak of Scott Tinley's Racing the Sunset. In discussion of Bernard Suits, we had a fun conversation about the role of humor and self-deprecation, both in philosophy and in teaching, so I enjoyed that. I misspoke a couple of times in our conversation. At one point, we were speaking of our mutual friend and acquaintance, Mel Edelman, and I called Mel Edwards. Mel Edwards is a different Mel in my life, so apologies to Mel Edelman there. And towards the end, I mentioned the International Powerlifting Federation, and I mistakenly called them the International Powerlifting Foundation. It's a federation, not a foundation. Just a little slip up there on my part. And our signal was also broken up a little bit, so if you may notice a little bit of editing in the video if you watch that, because we lost our signal a couple times. But nothing serious to be concerned about. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Bill Morgan.
Some mornings I'm more lucid than others. So if I go off the rails, just let me know, okay?
Yeah, that sounds good. I'm not
Yeah.
sure how I will know, but I will do my best.
Well, if I start gibberish,
Yeah.
you'll know at that point.
Maybe.
Fortunately, I'm not that far gone.
Well, I thought maybe we should get into it just because I don't want to take too much of your time.
Sure.
But I sent you a few questions in advance, just kind of a rough script of like how we would chat. And so the first thing I thought might be useful is for you to just kind of give a quick summation of kind of the story of Bill Morgan, who you are, how you got to, what you've done throughout your career, because some folks will be unfamiliar and it'd be good to let them know.
All right, sounds good. So for the most part, I was very mediocre student in high school and the like. I started school when I was 5, so I was a little bit younger than most of my other student peers, and I was part of the baby generation. So I remember, this is incredible. I was 5 at the time. I went to a parochial school, and I remember my mother took me to school before the school season started, and they were testing me to see if I could go in the first grade because I was so young. And I remember, to this day, I don't know how I remember this, but I remember the nun would write letters on the board and I had to copy the letters. And I remember one letter in particular, E, that I copied. And then I thought, this is kind of boring. So I added some lines and whatever. So somehow I got into school. High school, I was younger than everybody else. I was very immature.
Where is this? Where'd you grow up?
Williamsport, Pennsylvania. Sorry. I was born in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and grew up in Williamsport, Pennsylvania. I played Little League baseball. My father was a Little League coach. Of course, Williamsport, Pennsylvania is the home of the Little League itself.
Good place to be in Little League.
Yeah, World Series and all the like. And in high school, again, pretty mediocre student. And college, just pretty immature, hapless, not particularly great student. I struggled.
Where'd you go as an undergrad?
So I went to a small school, Lock Haven University, it's called now, and it wasn't too far from where I grew up in Williamsport. And my father died when I was a senior in high school, so that freshman year was rather difficult for me. And I got to be a little bit of a better student, but the big thing for me at Lock Haven was that a newly minted assistant professor from Penn State, Bob Osterhout, came to teach there.
Oh, yeah.
And Osterhout was someone quite different than anyone else I'd ever met. He was a true intellectual, widely read, extremely smart, erudite, and kind of saint-like personality, had no ego to speak of. And he took great interest in his students, and you would get a paperback with him filled with red marks, this and that. And
At least your papers were filled with red
oh
marks.
yeah, well, I saw the other papers too, but yeah,
Okay.
mine was definitely marked up as well. And but they were constructive criticisms, and I got to know him, and he was interested in philosophy. So that's how I got first start my interest. And he advised me to go to UMass Amherst for my master's, which was one of the better schools to go at that time. They had Harold van der Swag and Ellen Gerber in philosophy. They had Guy Lewis in history, and they had John Loy in sociology.
Yeah. So
So
sorry to
go
interrupt you,
ahead.
but
No, no.
some of this is useful. So Bob wrote one of the earliest texts on philosophy and sport,
Yeah, he
and
published
then
early anthology on a collection of
right,
original essays
right.
too.
And I
Exactly.
don't just this is just some more personal between you and I, but I don't know if you that Hal Lawson eventually ended up at Miami, where I am now.
Yes.
So
And I've
yeah.
never met Hal Lawson.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but I think he was a fellow student with Kretschmar, right?
Mm. Oh, I'm not sure about
Right.
that. Could be.
Yeah, and they were colleagues, and I think that Lawson knew Scott's father quite well.
Mm.
But at any rate, I had a great time at UMass. I really blossomed a little bit and started to get really interested in philosophy. And then I went back for my PhD to UMass. They just started a PhD program. And I spent the first year of my PhD at Amherst at UMass.
And you did that in
Uh,
philosophy proper, right?
yeah, no, actually, it was philosophy of sport.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and the I had I was taking, of course, a lot of courses in the philosophy department, but in the philosophy sports side of things, I I'd really gotten everything I could out of van der Swag and Gerber, and that sounds kind of crass, but I mean, I had taken all their courses, and
Yeah.
luckily the next year Osterhout landed a position at University of Minnesota, and he contacted me, and so I did the rest of my PhD at University of Minnesota. And the nice thing about their program was the course of study was decided by your advisor and your committee. So I took a couple of philosophy sport courses and a seminar from Bob, but everything else in the philosophy department.
Mm.
And I think it was that 3 years or so doing nothing but philosophy and working with Bob that was my launch point. And then my first job was at the University of Tennessee. I was there 24 years. And I married well. I married Susan Mitros, and Susan was a hot commodity and was being recruited at different universities. And so I was sort of the schmuck in the spousal deal. But I went to Ohio State. They were quite interested in having me. I think I even got an offer. No, I didn't get an offer before Susan, and then the same thing happened at USC, and I got an offer from USC before Susan decided she wanted to go there as well. So I spent 7 years at Ohio State. Those were great years. Worked with Mel Aileman in sport history, and in particular, Sarah Fields in sport history. Sarah and I were best friends. And of course, that's where I met you. And we had a nice cadre, I think, of students mutually interested in humanities.
Yeah.
And as far as, I mean, that might have been my best 7 years in terms of a cadre of students and colleagues. And then I moved on to USC, and I was actually in an occupational science department, which was very much like a kinesiology department. They had anthropologists, cultural anthropologists, they had neuroscience folks, they had some people in humanities, and they were also interested in play. So I fit in that perspective. And then I picked up a courtesy appointment in the School of Communication. They had a sports studies minor, and ended up teaching a lot of courses
Yeah.
in the communication school.
You've always been really interdisciplinary. That's part of what I loved about the OSU program, and
Yeah, we
view that
were, I
as a
mean,
strength.
the last 7 or 8 years at University of Tennessee, we were actually in a cultural studies department.
Mm.
And yes, that proved really valuable. And of course, I tried to make contacts in the philosophy department. I had a fair number of contacts in the philosophy department at University of Tennessee. And in fact, I still have a colleague who was at UT Philosophy during that time and is now went to Georgetown and retired. And we actually have a Zoom meeting every month and discuss various philosophical essays. So those are valuable contacts.
Nice. You mentioned Mel Edwards, who I adore, of course, and I looked over my shoulder. I have a cowboy hat back here. I didn't know if I should put that on in honor of Mel. I know you have a, you
My
have a,
first meeting with Mel, it was Mel Edelman. My first meeting with Mel, I mean, of course, if people don't know him, he's quite a character. And I remember I visited Columbus and we were going to meet for breakfast in some hotel. And Mel walked in with a cowboy hat on and yelling my name, Bill Morgan, Bill Morgan. And everybody's sort of looking like, who is this guy? And anyway, quite the character, that's for
yeah,
sure.
he is. So obviously, Bob Osterhout's a big influence on you, at least,
Huge.
early on and getting you rolling, so to speak. But in the sort of in the center of your career, I mean, who do you look to as being particularly influential on you?
In that respect, I would have to say Bob Simon was a big influence at Hamilton College. Bob was a first-rate philosopher and even a better human being. And I got quite close to Bob. As a matter of fact, when he had pancreatic cancer, I was communicating with him right up until the end of his life, unfortunately. But he was a big influence. Of course, Bernard Suits,
Mm-hmm.
and his work was heavily influential in terms of my interests. And John Russell, I have to give John. I started to get interested in normative theories and ethics when I was reading Bob's essay on internalism and internal values in sport. And then John Russell came out with an article on our rules, all that umpires have to work with, and started to show how much of what goes on in sport is rule governed, but an awful lot that goes on in sport as a space in which the rules really don't structure what's going on. So I got interested in then conventions, started reading David Lewis and Andre Marmor. And on the philosophy side of things, I started to read more historicist philosophers, that is, philosophers who gave much more attention to history in terms of their conceptions of practical rationality and the like. So that would be people like Bernard Williams, Robert Brandom was a big influence, John Searle, and of course, Richard Rorty. And I think I've read almost everything Rorty's published. He was a huge influence as well.
Mm-hmm. John, you mentioned John Russell in there. That paper, Our Rules, All an Umpire Has to Work With. That to me is a really useful heuristic in class for helping students understand um, not just the internal value of sports, but the role that officiating plays in governing. Right? He has this example of a player who crosses home plate and then tackles the catcher and interferes and so forth, and the umpire has to sort of, sometimes people call it legislate from the bench, right? He has to make a determination on the spot of like the rules say this, but the game says that. It's really a useful piece.
And his whole notion that Dworkin operates with in terms of judges, in terms of soft discretion. So the judge needs to have some discretion on, I mean, I think the most interesting case Dworkin talked about, and I think John mentions, is that there was a case of a grandfather who was quite wealthy, and he designated his grandson and as his principal beneficiary in his will. And the grandkid goes and kills his grandfather.
Oh, yeah, I know this case.
Of course, the will was perfectly valid and perfectly legal. And if you looked at the will alone, he should get the money. But then Dworkin reasoned that moral principles should play a role here as well, and that no one should profit from such a grievous moral harm. So from that, John launched into situations where even where there is an applicable rule, sometimes it steers you in the wrong direction. So
I don't. Do you recall? Didn't the courts side against the grandson in that case? I seem to
they
recall
did.
that.
They did, but
Rightfully so.
but there's other interesting case that Dworkin mentioned where two teenagers were riding, and the driver was his friend, and he got in an accident, and his pal, his other friend, suffered injuries, and so the insurance company sent him to their doctor. And in the course of the medical examination, they discovered that his friend had a life-threatening brain aneurysm. And rather than telling his friend, the doctor called up the insurance company, and they decided to hide this from him. And he did find out, and he didn't lose his life, but there was a case in which the courts ruled in favor of the insurance department. So it caused quite an uproar. But there's lots of very difficult cases in the law.
Yeah.
And I think what John nicely did is showed there's lots of difficult cases in the sport domain where it's hard to figure out how we should adjudicate. And the rules often let us down.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting stuff. And John's work's obviously really influential now. But
Yeah.
look, I was wondering, I asked in some of the questions I sent you ahead of time about key articles, key books, things that you think, a newer student to this area just couldn't go without. What'd you come up with on that? I know 3 is a real short list, right?
Yeah, that was pulling my hair on this one. But so it's a provisional characterization of what I would regard as some of the top articles, and I'm limited myself to 3. Obviously, one would be Suits's essay on the elements of sport, where he built on his earlier work when he talked about what is a game, and then that in the essay on elements of sport further carried it over to sport. So that was a big one. I also think D'Agostino's article on the ethos of sport was a really important one. In that before Robert Simon and Bob Simon and John Russell were writing about some of these issues with problems with the rules and the like, D'Agostino pointed out that, in fact, there's an ethos or a social, these would be social conventions or social understanding of how the game is to be played that actually influences whether a rule is applied or not. So, for example, in overtime, I think D'Agostino mentioned an NBA game. Often in overtime, the officials won't make certain calls because they want the players to decide the game. So that was a really important essay. And then I think Tom Herka has written some really superb articles recently. But probably his first, it was called Games and the Good, and it was in the Aristotelian Society journal. And if I had to pick, there would be certainly more, but those would be 3 of the top. Obviously, John's essay I mentioned is an important one, and Bob's Internalism, Internal Value essay is also an important one. And there's a lot of other work that I probably could cite, but those 3 came to the top for me.
Okay, good to know. And how about on the book front? The Grasshopper on the list? I'm guessing?
Yeah, obviously. The Grasshopper is definitely on the list. It's one of the best books that's ever been written on the topic. And I'm finding out more and more people in philosophy regard it as a classic. And then Thi Nguyen, a philosopher from the University of Utah, who's quite brilliant and quite wonderful. And he's written a book.
Oh, the recent book. Yeah.
Yeah, Games, Agency as Art. It's just a terrific book. And it's gotten a lot of attention in the philosophical world. And he has a very interesting take on play and sport that I think any aspiring student should definitely read. And then I'm going to pick an oldie but goodie, but a lot of people may not even be familiar with it. But a lot of people think Howard Schlusser wrote the first real philosophy of sport book back in 63, 64, maybe, called Man, Sport, and Existence. But he had a colleague at University of Southern California at the time, Eleanor Matheny, who wrote a nice little book that I think was a lot better than Schlusser's, and it was called Movement and Meaning. I don't think it's still available, but if you can ever find it in a used bookstore or like, I think it was a quite useful initial treatment of how to think about game and sport. So I'd throw that one in there as a kind of.
I've not read the Schlusser book. I haven't read the Schlusser book, and I don't mean to make.
Yeah, Schlusser book was heavily based in existential philosophy, and pretty much unreadable.
Well, the title jumped out. You said it. What was it?
Man, Sport, and Existence.
That is
And
an
the odd
ambitious
thing
title.
is, yeah, and the interesting thing is that Slusher was Scott Kretschmar's dissertation advisor as well as Bill Harper's.
Hmm.
And the interesting thing is Slusher, he got a very negative review that was published in Quest, and he was sort of demoralized by that. But at any event, he went to law school and became a professional sports agent, made a ton of money, and eventually ended up working in Nike. So
Hmm.
I don't recommend that career path unless you want to make a lot of money. But at any rate,
Sure. Well, I'm sure. I mean, we could probably talk for an hour long about, just the fascinating books that have been written, and more, in the late, really from like, it appears to me at least, from looking like 80s, 90s forward, things
yeah,
really
there's
kind of
been a
take
lot
off in the
more
area.
books written, and I think are really important. I mean,
Yeah,
I'm leaving them out, but again, you limited me to three, so
I
I
did.
tried my
Sorry about
best.
that. I listened
No,
to a podcast recently where they were talking about the number of fantastic books that are worth reading, and the number of hours in a human life,
yes,
and
exactly.
what a harrowing thought that is, of like so much stuff
Yeah.
you just can't, you won't ever get to it.
Well, I mean, if you turn my camera here, you'd see all my books, and I've cracked a lot of them, but I'll never get to
Yeah.
read all of them.
Well,
That's for
that
sure.
the man who hosts the pie, he said the same thing. I have all these books, knowing full well that I can't read them all.
Right. But you can refer to them, and
Sure, sure.
when other people do. So at any rate,
I wanted to ask also, when I was a student of yours, it was kind of a formative period in my life, but just, you know, every person at that phase in their life is going through formative experiences. But I changed a lot. I changed a lot of my views and perspectives on things. And so I always wonder about how change works. So that
mm,
led to my
mm,
question of, what's something philosophically substantive that you have changed your views on? Because moral psychology tells us that people effectively don't change their views. It's very, very uncommon,
right.
but it does
Especially
happen.
by argument, especially
You're
by the basis
right,
of
by force
argument.
of argument,
Yeah.
and it's usually by
Yeah.
emotion. Only,
Yeah.
the argument trails
Exactly.
emotion.
Exactly.
But I wonder, what's something substantive you think that
Well,
you've changed your views on?
I think the most substantive change was having read Suits and the like. I was pretty much a formalist, so I pretty much
Mhm.
had the view that if you wanted to know what the point and purpose of sport, what it was all about, was pretty much summed up in the formal elements that Suits limbed in his essays and his book. And so I had a very kind of formal ahistorical take on sport. Um, and uh, I think that the most substantive change occurred. Um, D'Agostino's book, essay on how the social context influences how we apply rules started me thinking. But then I started to read a lot more historicist philosophers, like Rorty, like Brandom, like Williams, and the like. And then I started thinking about conventions and how so many of what we do in our life are determined by conventions, what side of the road we drive on. What goes on in sport, although highly rule governed, highly rule structured, and like these conventions, these broad social understandings of how we play games and how we understand their purpose and how we understand their value, and the like. And I think my most substantive change then is to move in a much more historicist direction, and think about the historical context and how it greatly influences our various takes on, again, the value of sport. So, I mean, in my book, I talk about the gentleman amateur and how they view certain kinds of skills of the strategic nature as not legitimate athletic skills. And then we have the professional conception that came along, and the strategy very much became part of the picture. So that was my most formative change. It was being much more sensitive to the social and historical context in which sports and games are played, and how that influences our view of what they're all about, what are legitimate athletic skills, what is a legitimate mix of those skills, and how we should value sport.
And didn't you incorporate McIntyre into that quite a bit when you were talking about the
Yeah,
practical
actually, I
quality?
McIntyre, that's a good point. Reading McIntyre was also a big part of um, my change as well. That's what happens to you when you've been in the profession long enough and the like. You forget what it is you were reading at certain periods of time, as well as what you've written. I remember was at some conference and a famous philosopher was talking, and in the question and answer period afterwards, one of the students said, Professor, whatever his name was, I can't remember now, do you strongly believe in everything you've written? And his answer was only the things I can remember.
Mhm.
At how I went to a conference and they were actually talking about in this a panel discussion, my own book, first book. And I remember listening, thinking, I don't remember saying any of those things or writing any of those things. So I immediately recalled what this professor had said and see, I guess I now understand what he means, only those things that you remember.
Yeah. It's funny. I have a copy of my dissertation on my bookshelf in my office. And maybe a year or two ago, I opened it and started reading it. And it was odd. It was as if someone else had written it. And
Yeah, exactly.
at one point I was reading and I thought, oh, this is not good. I'm gonna step in a hole here in just a moment. But then I was pleased to see that my younger self saw the hole coming, and I had a sort of reasonable approach to it, and I got through it, and I was, oh, okay, I'm proud of me. I did a good job with
Yeah,
that.
exactly. Yeah,
So,
that happens. Sometimes it's not always a good outcome, but that
yeah,
good
yeah,
outcomes sometimes happen, which is you hang on to as many of those as you can.
yeah. You reminded me of this too. You might appreciate this. My neighbor has a bumper sticker that says, "Don't believe everything you think," and
Yeah,
I always
exactly.
kind of
I
like
like
that one.
that.
Yeah, it's
I
clever.
like that. I like that.
So
Oh, there
okay,
you
so that.
are.
Oh, you see
I
me
can
again?
now
Good.
see you.
Yeah,
Okay.
good. I was wondering, some of the articles you've published about caring, the ethic of care, wholehearted engagement, the importance of what you care about from Frankfurt. That stuff really resonated with me, and I've cited them several times and worked with my students with them. I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I think it's really important, and I think part of the inspiration was from the tail end of Suits's essay on the elements of sport, where he talks about sport and seriousness. And on the ordinary conception of seriousness, it's basically the things in our ordinary life are what makes life serious. So, going to school, getting a job, having a career, making a decent living, and the like. And then everything outside of that is sort of like icing on the cake. And the basic idea is that playing games and sports really are serious only in a derivative way. And what I mean by that, or what he meant by that, is that insofar as they allow us to go back to work or to enliven our ordinary lives and the like, sports and games are serious, but in themselves, they're not.
Mm.
And it's there that that Suits rather points out that things like sport and music and art are actually what he calls intrinsic goods. And he defined intrinsic goods as those things that justify everything else, or those things that we just intrinsically value. And he went on to point out that while on the ordinary conception of seriousness, play and game and the like turn out to be rather unserious or derivatively serious activities, on a more enriched conception of our lives, the point of life is really to find something that you truly intrinsically value and enjoy, that you would do even if there was no instrumental payoff of any kind. And that a good life would be a life devoted to those things that you really intrinsically value.
Mm.
And I think for me, uh, it indicated that if you want to lead a good life, then you have to find some way to break this sort of chain of instrumental means and ends. For example, going to college is important because it leads to a degree. So the degree is more important than going to college, but they're connected. And then getting a degree is important because it's a means of getting a job, and the job's more important than getting a degree. And then a job is important because it leads to being able to lead a decent life and make enough money, blah, 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 blah. And in all of these cases, whatever it is you're presently doing is serious, but not as important or serious as what you hope to have as an outcome.
Hmm.
And what Suits tried to show is actually the way to look at life is to turn that upside down and to think about and to try to find something that's meaningful to you and intrinsically valuable that doesn't have any instrumental payoff. And then try to find some way of living your life where you're doing that kind of thing, that kind of activity, as much as possible. So I'm unfortunately in the capitalist market kind of society in which we live in, everybody focuses on the career, but nobody really focuses on, well, is your work meaningful? Do you derive intrinsic value and joy from it and the
Yeah.
like? And for me, that's where I think sport and again, the arts and those sorts of things, rather than falling outside the mainstream of life and being less important, I think they are actually the things that make life worth living in the first place.
Yeah, you said something there, and I wonder if you want to clarify, or if I can clarify it, and maybe you can either agree or disagree. You said that as so long as it doesn't have instrumental value, but in one of your papers you pointed out it's okay that it has instrumental value,
Yes.
so long as you
Yes.
don't let that distract you from the intrinsic value, right?
Yeah, well, yeah, that's exactly right. It's not that it needs to be totally bereft or empty of instrumental value, but that it's the intrinsic value of the activity that's drawing your
Yeah,
motivation and the like. If it has instrumental benefits, all the more,
right. Are you familiar with the
easy.
case of Ryan Shea, the distance runner? Do you know about him?
No, I don't.
I use him as an example, both when I teach suits and when I talk about some of your work on wholehearted engagement. He was a marathoner, an elite marathoner, and it turned out that he had a cardiac AFib.
Ooh,
When he was diagnosed with this, his doctors effectively told him, "You can't continue to train the way that you do, given this heart condition. We have to get this, under control." And because he had lived a life extremely dedicated to this pursuit, it was the thing that made him who he was. He continued running, and he ended up having a
mm,
heart attack, I think, in the New York Marathon, and he died.
oh
And
gosh.
so I talk to my students about that as, is this a tragedy? Is this a triumph? Here's a person who, it's one thing if you go out and run and you don't know you have an AFib and you die, that's
Right.
effectively an accident. This man knew, he knew, and he was still not
Yes.
willing to give that thing up. I mean, he
Right.
literally was willing to risk his life for it, which is pretty
Right.
remarkable.
It is. It is.
Many of my
The
many of
Go
my
ahead.
students view it more as triumph than tragedy, but it's certainly a mix. It's kind of a
Right.
continuum, but I think most
Right.
lean towards the triumph than tragedy part, which I always find interesting when they respond to that.
Yeah, and I think that might be because they're pretty young themselves.
I think they
When you get
romanticize
older,
it quite a bit.
yeah, when
Yeah.
you get older, you
Yeah.
start. There is a wonderful book called Racing the Sunset by his first name is Scott, and I'm embarrassed I can't remember his last name because we we've been friends off and on for a while. I mean, I haven't lost contact with him recently, and he was an Ironman athlete, and he was a top world class professional Ironman athlete. He made a living at it, and he usually won Ironman competitions. And he talks about in Racing the Sunset that in the running part, which is I believe the last part of the Ironman competition, I think
I can't remember. Yeah.
it's swimming, biking,
And running.
maybe I'm not sure where. At any rate, he was running and he saw a beautiful bird. And this is again at the top of his career, and he stopped to watch it.
Hmm.
And so his case was slightly different. He realized that what had been the focal point of his entire life, the Ironman competitions, that it wasn't his focal point anymore. And he crashed. He didn't know what to do with himself, and he went through a long period. And he actually got interested in athletic retirement, which he equated with essentially dying because you can't do what you love anymore.
Yeah. Yeah.
And but then he found something else. Um, so the difference with your example is he found something else to um, that was an intrinsic good for him, and it turned out to be writing and creative work and academic work. So it works in
Yeah.
all sorts of interesting ways. But I think the
That's,
essential point in both
oh,
stories is that if you really want to live a good life where you really care about what you're doing and the like, it's going to be an intrinsic good that's going to be the thing that you need
yeah.
to find.
I think if I recall, that was part of Herka's critique of Suits was that the
Yeah,
best thing in life must be more than just what you enjoy doing.
Well, I think he critiqued the idea it could only be games.
Yeah.
But I think he agreed with the essential idea of
Yeah.
of intrinsic
Yeah.
goods.
Yeah. That's quite interesting. Okay, so let me think about what else I was gonna. So there was that. I'm embarrassed to say I haven't had a chance to read this, but I know that SEP did that. Sport Ethics and Philosophy. There was a special issue dedicated to Bill Morgan. What must
Yeah.
that be like?
Actually, it was a little embarrassing at first. So I have to sort of explain this. But I have a colleague at USC, Dan Durbin, who is in the School of Communication. And for the last 8 or 9 years at my USC, I had an office next to Dan's in the School of Communication building. And so we became fairly close, and Dan's done a lot of grant work and had a number of conferences and the like on sport. And I've been part of those conferences.
Sorry.
Yeah, Sigmund was also here doing his sabbatical at USC. And Sigmund and Dan got together because my retirement was coming up, and they contacted Mike McNamee, who was the editor of
Yeah.
SEP at that point. And I knew nothing about this. And it turns out that I only found out because I was having lunch with Dan and told him I was going to Croatia to give a paper around the same time they had planned a special conference for me. So Dan sort of had to spill the beans and tell me about it. At any rate, he invited a number of people over, and I mean, it's just wonderful. People are talking about what you've written and what you find interesting and the like. And, there were some good critical papers, but you get good constructive feedback. And it was very flattering. And it also gave me a chance, something I normally don't do, to think about the long arc of my own work. I usually write something and then move on to something else and don't think about what I've written about in the past that much.
Yeah.
So it forced me to go back and look at things that I've written. And it's forced me to think about, sort of gave me an overview of my own sort of scholarly development and what I was interested in and the like. So that was just, utterly delightful.
Well,
But I certainly, go ahead.
did it also produce a certain? I mean, I thought by analogy of a peer review, right? You write a paper, it goes in, you get anonymous feedback from two folks, which
Right.
can sometimes induce a lot of anxiety and stress.
Sure.
But
Sure.
instead of that, you didn't have two folks, you had dozens. It
Yes.
must have felt like a mob coming from you for you at some
Yeah.
point.
It's interesting. Early on, I sort of would have looked at it that way. But at this point in my career and life, it's like, oh, all these people are actually interested enough to react to something I've written.
Yeah.
So it becomes, I mean, the angst and is always there. So, you're only as good as your next paper, your next book.
Yeah.
You hope that people find it persuasive and the like. But on the other hand, you start to think, well, gee, maybe nobody's reading any of this. And that's a
I,
more horrible thought, actually.
you know,
So it was less, I think at one point in my career, I would have viewed it as, oh my God, all these people are coming at me. But for me, it was a really kind of joyous
yeah.
uh, sort of effort to sort of respond to people I respect, who, because they respected me, they weren't, I hope, just saying nice things about me. And in fact, they were saying some things that were critical. But it really was a nice opportunity to think about, again, the long arc of stuff that I've written. So it was totally enjoyable. The embarrassing part was there's other senior people in the field that deserve the same sort of recognition that haven't gotten it. So I feel a little, bad about that, because I think, like Scott Kretschmar certainly deserves to have a special issue, and there's other senior people as well.
Yeah, Scott's tremendous.
Yeah.
It's interesting to hear you say that, because I'm not even a tenure track scholar. I write and publish as freelance effectively. And so I've joked with my wife before, I publish these articles, and occasionally someone will write a response or cite me or whatever. And then I'll run to her and say, oh, someone actually read that crap I wrote.
Yeah.
Half the
Well, it's
time
not crap, Sam. You've written some really good stuff. So
well,
give yourself more career, and being tenure track is not the point. It's your academic career.
Yeah. But it was, folks have been critical of some of the stuff I've done, but it was just odd. I guess for a while, I naively thought like nobody ever reads this stuff anyway.
You're right, but they do. That's the interesting thing. And I remember when I was in Japan for a conference, and I was in a subway with Sigmund and several other people who were at the conference. We were in Kyoto, and um, the the person who hosted me in Croatia sent me a magazine article that they had interviewed me when I was in Croatia, and there's this big picture of me. So in the middle of the ride, I pulled open the thing and just opened it up and showed everyone the photograph. It was meant to be a joke.
Sure.
It took a while for people to see it, and then they all started laughing. So anyway, it was great fun.
That's
Great fun.
funny. Yeah. Well, so you mentioned, the arc of your career, and it's a delicate question to ask because I don't want to, you know, a cynical interpretation of the question could sound like, Bill, you're getting up there in years, but
Yeah, well, I'm old.
don't hear it that way. Don't hear the question
No,
that
no,
way.
no, but I am.
The
I mean,
question really is, how do you? I don't know, I don't like the word legacy, but I suppose it's the best word. I mean, what do you hope for? Obviously, you have this posterity of everything that you've written that will
right.
long outlast you. I'm sorry to say, but I'm not breaking news to you there.
No.
What do you hope the impression is? I mean, do you hope people look back and think of this whole corpus? I mean, how do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think my answer is going to be a cop out, but I think it's for others to say what my legacy is. If I had to say anything about my legacy, it would be that I hope that um, I've written enough and taught enough that it affected and it influenced people in positive ways. And they think that on my tombstone, it might be something like, he did the best he could and he wrote some decent stuff. I think that's really how I look at it. Um, and, I mean, I'm not a religious person, so I'm pretty much of the view that when I conk out, that's it. So if I have any posterity, it'll be in what I've written, other people that I've taught. The remarkable thing for me is I realized when I retired that I'd been a university professor for just over 40 years,
Mm-hmm.
which is a staggering long period of time, it seems. But looking retrospectively, it's like, my God, how did those 4 decades
Yeah.
go by so quickly? I remember the last class I taught at USC. I told the students that I was retiring, and they were very nice, and some of them wrote me nice notes and the like. But I tried to think about the moment of giving my last lecture and then leaving class and walking back to my office. I tried to sort of dedicate that to my memory because that was the end of my teaching career.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of the writing, I just hope I've left something that people can chew and think about that might be positive, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
That's it.
You mentioned the tombstone. I'm sorry to say I've already picked mine out. I saw one years ago that just said,
Oh,
"I told you."
really?
I saw one that said, "I told you I was sick." That was quite good.
I want to be cremated. I don't want to be buried anywhere.
I
So
agree with you there.
yeah, yeah,
Speaking of that, as a former student of yours, and something that's carried on with me, I've been around you and talked to you enough about it to know that you find the grasshopper fantastically funny, and I do
yes,
too. I think it's just the fact that the book itself is a game so
yeah,
delicately woven together with this like incredibly snarky sense of humor just makes me laugh every time I
right.
read it. And I try to inflect humor into the way that I teach, and I think that I
Yes.
got a lot of that from you.
Oh, really? Okay.
I think
I'm
so.
sorry. It depends how
Well,
good your humor is.
I think it's
Mine's
for the
pretty
better.
bad.
I think it's for the better. It's that type of humor, that dry humor that doesn't get the guffaw laugh, but it does get the sly grin. You know.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So I wonder. I was going to ask you. This is sort of unscripted, to share a funny story or to reflect on something that always makes you chuckle.
Oh
And that's
God.
kind of on the spot, right?
Yeah, yeah. I don't know. I can't really think of any particular episode.
Sure.
I don't really have any specific memories other than I used to be really serious. I remember when I was at UT, University of Tennessee, I would come in to the office and say hi to everybody in the front office, but I go straight back to my office and close my door. And I just was serious. And then I think Don Franks was department head at University of Tennessee. He had a great sense of humor. And I realized that my seriousness betrayed a sense of maybe intellectual snobbery. I don't know. But at any rate, I realized that the best way to get a point across was to be serious, but then to lace it with humor so that, you don't end up taking yourself too seriously, because after all, in philosophy, almost everything anybody writes gets criticized at some point.
Mm.
And so it just seemed to me that that would be the more natural way to go. And I just started incorporating humor. And unfortunately, from my wife's standpoint, Susan, I try to do it in all my life, and it's not even conscious at this point. And the important part of being humorous is that the humor's, funny. But I don't
Yeah.
know how funny I was, but
Yeah.
sometimes I thought I was pretty funny, and students would laugh and the like. But it was just a way of breaking the ice and getting people to get in touch with the subject rather than,
Yeah.
any mannerisms of the professor, I suppose.
Well, and there's a certain type of, you mentioned the fear of intellectual snobbery. A
Yeah.
lot of the jokes that you make, which I always appreciated, are sort of tongue-in-cheek self-deprecation,
Oh, absolutely self-deprecate.
which obviously like disarms you, right? It's a way of you
Right.
dropping your shield and saying like, don't be
Yeah.
afraid to approach and discuss and
Right.
so forth, which I
Exactly.
always liked.
Oh, good. Well, I'm glad that got through, and I hope it did with my
Yeah.
other students as well.
I have a 9-year-old daughter who she's the fulcrum of most of my jokes, and she is a
Ah,
very good barometer. She'll, Dad,
not
it's
good.
it's not funny. Move
Yeah.
on from that one,
Yeah.
Dad. But
Yeah.
she'll tell me if it's funny, reluctantly sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So
Susan does that for me.
yeah, yeah. Sarah
And
does as
it's
well,
and
but
it's usually it wasn't funny.
yeah. Okay, so there's a couple other questions I want to get to. Sorry, I like spent all this time on my questions.
Oh, no, it's fine.
One quick thing, and then there's a few questions from our members that I wanted to ask. I'm on the executive committee now as the webmaster for our organization, the International Association for the Philosophy of Sport. One of the things that some of us are eager to do is to grow our membership, to enhance diversity, to get more people in. Do you have thoughts on that? I mean, how do you think about who we
Yeah,
recruit and how?
I don't have anything insightful to say. Unfortunately, philosophy in general has been
I know.
white male bastion. And our international association in the very beginning was a white male bastion. And I think we have made significant inroads in terms of women in the field. Still not anywhere where it should be. As far as further diversity, it's, I don't have a clue. The only way I can think of growing the discipline is to attract as many people who work in philosophy departments as we can.
Yeah, that's my thought.
Unfortunately, I'm somewhat um, I'm somewhat far from optimistic that in kinesiology departments, sport humanities are taken seriously. There's so few places where you can go to study these days. And so to me, I think that the outreach to the broader philosophy community, which itself isn't very diverse, but it's a start anyway.
Yeah.
So I think the quality work in our journal is really, really important. So the journals have got to be top quality to attract other philosophers, but that's far from a solution. It's only a first step. And I guess in terms of kinesiology circles, figuring out some way where the humanities might be taken seriously again. I mean, when I was a student, it was exercise physiology that dominated. But now it's a lot of different areas, and in particular, sport management.
Yeah.
Almost every position now is in sport management, and they do allow a little bit for ethics of sport, which seemingly is only one of several things they're looking for,
Yeah.
which is absurd.
I noticed,
But
you see jobs that are like, we want you to teach sport marketing, sport econ, and ethics, and it's like,
yeah, it's
so
like
you're 3 experts now, like,
yeah, and obviously the ethics part probably gets slighted a fair
yeah,
amount.
yeah, I'm
So
afraid so.
yeah, I wish you guys luck. I don't know. Philosophy's been terribly unsuccessful as well, and but I don't really have anything insightful to say, Sam. I'm sorry to say.
Okay, let's talk about something that we there's more ground to be gained on. Javi Lopez Frias wrote in a question for us.
Yeah,
So one of
couple.
which is playful and one of which is not so much. He says, if your library is about to be destroyed, what book do you save?
Yeah,
I'd save one, he says.
I I'm not happy Javi asked this question. I meant that to be in a funny way.
Sure.
I mean, I don't know how to possibly answer that. So the only thing I came up with is um, something that Richard Rorty wrote, but and there's a lot of other philosophers I'm interested in. So that was difficult to come to that point. And then I think because I think Rorty is a far better essayist than he is a writer of books, uh, my one thing I would try to say would be Richard Rorty and his critics. It was a volume edited by Robert Brandom in which Rorty responds to some of the top philosophers like um, uh, uh, in the world. And I probably that would be the book I'd probably try to say.
Hmm.
Javi's not going to be happy with that answer, but I wasn't happy with his question.
Well, there you go. Trade, you know, even trade there.
Yeah.
And then he also asked about broad internalism. How did you come up with your particular
Yeah, and
critique of
that
that?
comes back to something we talked about. When I started reading John Russell stuff and Bob Simon stuff, and Nick Dixon wrote a nice essay as well.
Hmm.
And then I started reading some Dworkin as well. And I thought, there's something missing here because we're getting more and more abstract. We're going from formal rules to more abstract principles of flourishing and those sorts of things. And it's by reading Rorty and other historicist philosophers, I thought, there's a lot going on that's historically and socially grounded that nobody's talking about. And I think that the problem with some of these abstract principles is that the further away we get from the actual practice, the more difficult it is to come up with something normatively relevant to say in terms of how it could actually guide our actions in some concrete way. And that's what this historical direction started to get me to think, and then I started thinking about conventions. So that's how that developed. It was, we're getting more and more abstract, we're going more and more philosophical, but yet we're overlooking some concrete, intuitive ways of thinking that pretty much are not formally decided. They're pretty much implicit social normative expectations we have of how people should act. And then I started reading a little bit of history of sport and actually realized, in fact, these conventions played a large role in how we valued sport and how we thought about what it was all about and how we thought what skills were relevant to it. So that's the path. That's the path that led me to where I am now in my last book. It is a sort of reaction to we're overlooking something important here.
Yeah. Okay. Well, hopefully, maybe Javi will be more satisfied with that question or that response, I should say.
Hope so. Hope so.
Jake Watowitz. I hope I'm
I
pronouncing.
don't know how to pronounce his name
I
either.
hope I have got that. Sorry, Jake, if that's a terrible mispronunciation. He asked, "What's the most significant way, or some examples of doing in which the examples of how doing the philosophy of sport has changed the way you engage with sport? I know you're a Minnesota Vikings fan. How has your
Yeah.
scholarship influenced your thoughts on them?"
No, it didn't. That's just that's the religious part of my life.
Yeah, right.
It's a leap of faith, especially in terms of how unsuccessful they've been. I think the most interesting way it's affected me is how totally dissatisfied I am with the sport media.
Mm,
They do a reasonably good job of covering the games and the like, but in terms of any interesting social, complex cultural issues, they're just terrible. They're just shallow. And I was even listening to NPR, and a woman had written a piece about trans athletes and like, and she wrote in the Atlantic, which is a very, very good
yeah,
magazine. But
yeah.
her presentation in the podcast was just sort of silly and supercilious. And so for me, it's just that I'm just totally dissatisfied with the public discourse about sport and particularly in the media. And I think I think I'm really frustrated that philosophy of sport hasn't really been able to make an impact there. And that's the way it's most affected me, I would say.
Do you think that's a function of the for-profit domination, the unwillingness to step on sport in a critical way because it might
Yeah,
turn out?
absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I've noticed it at USC. USC has a very good film school, and also in the school of communication, they've got a lot of students who are interested in sport media. and it's hard sometimes to coax them to get below the surface level.
Yeah.
And they essentially they want to BS about sport.
Right.
And of course, I don't want to do that. So yeah, I've noticed it a lot at USC in
I think
particular.
the concern, and it's just purely pragmatic, is, if you turn a critical eye on sport, you'll lose your access.
Yeah,
And
yeah, exactly. And if you want a career in sport broadcasting, like that's not the way to get it,
yeah. Okay, so
unfortunately.
one other write-in question. This one's from John Pike. It's about Leah Thomas. You mentioned trans athletes and the coverage in the media, so it's a nice segue. John asked about Leah Thomas. He asked, I think he's quoting you here. Does Leah Thomas represent a sort of moral disobedient or an entrepreneur like Kathy Switzer, a cheater, something else? What do you think of John's question?
Yeah, so John is far more conversant with this topic than I am. So I'm skating a little bit on thin ice, but let me make a stab at it. First, a slight misunderstanding. Actually, Catherine Switzer wasn't a moral entrepreneur herself. So in that chapter, I was trying to point out that there are moral disruptors. I think Switzer was a moral disruptor insofar as she brought a spotlight on, or shined a spotlight on, a certain categorization of sport and conception of sport that obviously excluded females. So we need moral provocateurs like her to sort of disrupt the sort of the ordinary moral manner of things, and she certainly did that. If people are familiar with her, she surreptitiously entered the Boston Marathon when women weren't allowed to compete, and an official actually tried to tackle her and prevent her from participating in
Yeah,
the.
kind of a pretty ugly scene actually when that
Yeah,
happened.
it was ugly. But at that point, the sports journalists and like said, what the hell is she doing running? She's a woman. So she was a disruptor. The entrepreneurs were the people who figured out a way to reconceive sport in terms of policy and the like. And so you have, co-ed sport, and then you have sex segregated sports where only available for women so they could engage in sports. Those were the moral entrepreneurs. So the two kind of go together. Now, Leah Thomas, if I think about her, um, I don't think she's a cheat. I mean, and for me, it has a lot to do with the fact that cheating is a lot like lying. And that is, it's not just saying something that ends up being false, but it's saying something that you know to be false and trying to get people to accept it as true. So it involves a certain duplicity and deception. And I don't think there's any of that in Leah Thomas's case. And certainly she's been given the official blessing of a fair number of sport organizations. So I wouldn't call her a cheat. Um, she's a little bit like Switzer insofar as she's shaking the moral order of things up. So she is a moral disruptor of sorts, and she's sort of provoked people to think about, well, how do we handle trans athletes? What place in the world of sport should they be allocated? And in that sense, I think she's forced us to start to rethink how we think about sport. So in that sense, she's like Switzer. She's a bit of a moral disruptor. My problem, however, is that unlike the Switzer case, the Leah Thomas case, the moral disruption actually poses a moral problem with how it's been achieved so far. And that is to say, it's upended a basic value in sport of fairness and a reasonable chance to succeed in sport beyond differences in skill and strategy and the like.
Mm.
So it's posed a problem with fairness to women athletes, cisgender athletes, in terms of how we can include transgender athletes without upending the opportunity for women athletes to achieve athletic excellence. So what I'd have to say about Leah Thomas, is that her moral provocateur role remains uncertain at this point. We have to wait for solutions to how we deal with this issue, and some people are trying to wrestle with that now. And John Pike is one of the most important people in that respect, in terms of his notion of Rawls's lexical priority, where certain values would have to take priority over others. In rugby, particular, would have to be safety. Other authors have argued for balancing and for handicapping transgender athletes so that they don't pose a fairness problem and the like. But so far, nobody's sort of rethought how we might think about sport in terms of transgender athletes. So we're waiting for some more entrepreneurs to come on the scene to help us with this, to reconceptualize sport. So far I haven't seen anything in the literature that looks promising. I do want to note, and John talks about this in his rugby paper a little bit. He refers to Gleaves, like an essay that Gleaves co-wrote, that argued that we need to get beyond basic values like fairness, and he argues that we reconceive sport as a sort of kind of storytelling story we tell about ourselves, and of course gender stories are among the most important of those stories. But that doesn't seem to me to be a plausible redescription of sport. I think what Gleaves is doing is misconstruing sport for narrative literature, for example. And that's not to deny that trans athletes and other athletes are able to tell stories about themselves by engaging in sport. But those stories have to be mediated by their actual engagement in the sport itself. And there, once again, that reimports the importance of notions like fairness. So I don't think that Gleaves' interpretation is plausible.
Yeah.
So that leads me to say at this point, Leah Thomas is in the questionable moral provocateur part of the scheme at this point. And I think we're wrestling now with what I call a moral entrepreneur, someone who can redescribe sport in a way that gives a legitimate opportunity to trans athletes without impinging on the fair opportunity and equality of women athletes in particular.
Yeah. I've not read Gleaves' paper on that, although I know John a little bit. But hearing you describe it, I thought, well, that just doesn't seem like quite enough to explain this phenomena. But
Yeah,
you're skating on thin ice. I'm skating on water. I haven't even read it, so I don't know.
Yeah, and John Pike is doing some excellent work in this. So I look forward to his further work. But I think Leah Thomas is, at this point, more so a moral confounder than a moral provocateur, I guess.
I think about this, and I haven't touched this subject. You wouldn't know it from my svelte physique, but I work with our powerlifting club on campus. And I do a bit of powerlifting myself. And this has been a real challenge with the IPF, International Powerlifting Foundation, of transgender athletes and how to handle that, because that's a sport more than many others where
power
sex differences are enormous in some cases, especially regarding upper body strength.
Yes.
So
exactly.
It's been really tough for them to deal with that. I don't envy the executives in that sport. So it's tough.
They've had issues with performance enhancing drugs as well. And one issue was that, you just form into competition groups, but the problem is that people sandbag. So they form into a non-performance enhancing group, and they actually use performance enhancing drugs.
You're still in the prisoner's dilemma. You're just asking.
The honor system just doesn't work, I'm afraid.
No, not at all. Not at all. It's an obvious advantage waiting to be taken. So so that's really I just wanted to sort of pick your brain a little bit, Bill, and create a sort of open window for people who aren't lucky enough to come to our conferences and see you and hear you. I know you're still active and coming, but we wanted to sort of put something together and do some more to get our members out there and engaged and get people.
I think it's a great idea, Sam. And again, I'm flattered you asked me, and I'm only happy to do it. And I hope you keep doing it. I think would be a valuable resource for people to, just see what somebody's like that they might have read and hear their take on various things.
Well, what gave me the idea, we screened a lecture with permission from Bernard Suits at our most recent conference.
Right.
And it occurred to me that I had never seen him in two dimensions. I had only seen him in black and white on paper.
Right.
And it was marvelous. And I thought, what if people think of all of these wonderful people in this room that way?
Exactly.
So let's see them animated.
No, it's a great idea. I mean, I had the privilege of hearing Bernie given a lot of papers, and I had the not necessary privilege of interacting with him in social occasions. He was quite a character
I've
himself.
heard stories. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, plenty of stories. But yeah, a lot of people, and when Javi first showed me that, a brief clip of it, I remarked to Javi and Cesar, I had forgotten what Bernie sounded like. And he was extremely articulate, extremely bright, and was a gorgeous writer. Just
Yeah. Yeah.
unlike a lot of philosophers that Suits could write. Could
Well,
definitely.
I put them in front of my students and try to persuade them of the magic that's in front of them. And a lot
Oh,
of them
that's
get
great.
it, but a few of them don't. And I just want to shake them by the shoulders and say, come on, really think about this. This is
Yeah.
fantastic.
Well, you're doing a great job.
Oh,
Appreciate it. It's wonderful interacting with you, Sam.